Rap didn't just appear in 1975 fully formed. It was developed in New York, sure, but the Bronx didn't birth rap, so where did it come from?
Listen, rap is something you do, hip-hop is something you live.
Rapping about rapping,
that I be the MC's MC.
And that right there is the origin of rap.
That's all you want to think about, rap.
I often see it claimed that rap had its start out in Jamaica, which sounds like a logical explanation if you listen to those 60s and 70s DJs. I mean, the styles of Count Machuki, King Stitt, and U-Roy closely resemble what was to come. But these New York kids didn't listen to Jamaican DJs, so where did they get their rhymes from? Closer to home, a clear and explicit reference point was the Beat Poets, and one album cited more than any other by early proponents of the style, 1971's Hustlers Convention. This is pinned by a lot of early MCs as one of their main influences, and as the record that became the impetus for mid-70s rap. Hustlers Convention is a Beat Poets record, not dissimilar to The Last Poets, but what made it stand out were the kinds of stories being told on the record. These were funny stories, these were relatable stories. For the kids in the Bronx, these were just more relatable, more down to earth. This was just one of many Beat Poet records out in the world, but Hustlers Convention held this special place for early DJs and MCs. And to understand why this might be, I want to take a look at a book. Here. This book is called The Life, the Lore and Folk Poetry of the Black Hustler. This details dozens of street rhymes and toasts from the 1950s and 60s, and it includes a lot of rhyme schemes that we first heard on wax with Hustlers Convention and then with the first hip-hop records at the end of the 70s. In fact, there's one toast I wanted to highlight in particular here. It's called Sporting Life, and it uses a lot of the same rhyme schemes that Big Bank Hank and, well, Grandmaster Caz use on Rapper's Delight. And by the way, I've got a whole other video specifically about Rapper's Delight if you want to have a look at that. In a way, we can consider Hustlers Convention as a kind of moment that gave permission to hip-hop kids to transition these street poems or toasts from the streets into the parties and the clubs. But I briefly want to circle back to Sporting Life, which, although it was recorded in the 1960s, includes some phrases or vernacular that were much more common in the 30s and 40s. So, although it was recorded in the 60s and was then first put on wax in the 70s, well, it could be 30 or even 40 years older than that. We can also confidently look back to the early 1960s in New Orleans. In fact, H-Rap Brown, in his autobiography, actually details a few dozen rhymes whose schemes were carried on and would be very familiar to early hip-hop listeners. I think, in particular, Prince Whipper-Whip of the Fantastic Freaks was perhaps the best at using this kind of style.
See what I mean? I am the New Yorker, the street walker, the woman stalker, the job talker, the money maker, the safe breaker. Boy, you better watch it go, cause I'm the man that'll take. I'm the least conceited, I'm undefeated, never been beat, sound so sweet. Prince Whipper-Whipper, yes, the ones they know, the professional magician of the microphone.
Aside from street poetry and the dozens, thinking about mainstream exposure to rap, we can go back to 1968. When Pigmeat Markham, a comedian and actor, laid down a funky track that was much more like the hip-hop records to come than something like The Last Poets or Hustlers Convention.
Cats got to listen to me because I am the judge that you can plainly see. I want a big round table when I get there. I won't sit down to wonder square. I'm gonna lay down the law. They better not budge. I bust some head because I am the judge.
Here Comes the Judge is often cited as the earliest rap record. Not explicitly hip-hop, it couldn't be, but a kind of jumping off point. But then, it wasn't created in a vacuum. It wasn't a revolution. Rap wasn't a foreign concept to its listeners. And the reason for that is black radio DJs. Phrasing borrowed from jazz circles of the 30s and 40s finally made its way onto the airwaves by the early 50s. And Southern black radio in particular pushed this to a wider audience, with DJs like Hep Cat and Jack the Rapper leading the way.
Now she can break it, or she can shake it. Yes, that gal can hang it up on the wall. She can throw it out the window, and I'll be there for it fall. Now if you ever go to East Texas, boys, you ought to stop by Palestine. Then you see my baby, my darling, Hattie Green.
What started in the 50s as simply an easier way to transition between records was developed into distinct styles by the end of the 60s by DJs like Frankie Crocker in New York or Jocko Henderson in Philadelphia.
Sitting I'm thrilled to say it's still the hottest show on the radio with your engineer Jocko. Back on the scene with the record machine. Correct time now, 10:16.
By the time Pigmeat Markham came around, he was just emulating what people had been hearing radio jocks do for years. And then when King Tim III and Rapper's Delight came around at the end of the 70s, it wasn't so much a revolution as just a natural extension of that. So then why do people think that rap came from Jamaica? Well, partly it's because Kool Herc, one of the fathers of hip-hop, was from Jamaica too. But the truth is, the rap or DJ culture in Jamaica came from the exact same place as it came from in the US. Back in the 50s and 60s in Jamaica, they could pick up some of the same radio stations that people listened to in the US. So those early DJs of Count Machuki and King Stitt explicitly cite US radio as their source or their inspiration for doing what they did. But you know, there's a lot more to that story. In the early years of hip-hop, a lot of time was taken collating these numerous sources, from the life to the dozens, and then putting different twists on them. And these influences still impact our culture today, so I thought it was worth going over kind of what they all were, where they all came from. The US was always home to rap, but it can't be pinned to one progenitor, one jumping off point. I mean, look at all of the things I just barely touched on. A glancing nod towards jazz, the radio jocks that brought rap back to New York and made sure it was there for the 70s kids. The distinct and unique rap or DJ culture in Jamaica. I'm editing this now and I realize while I'm listing things that I forgot about or barely touched on, I didn't even mention James Brown. I didn't even mention the Jubilaires. Like, there are a lot of things that I just totally spaced on, totally forgot about. So I guess we'll have to do a part 2, huh? All of which is to say that I've got a few videos I'm working on looking at all of the different moving parts that brought us to modern rap and hip hop. So subscribe if you want to see those over the coming months. And as always, thanks for watching. This could be long, or maybe I'm just screwing up a bunch. It's one or the other, it can't be both. I can't.